In 2020, then presidential candidate Joe Biden beat Donald Trump in Massachusetts by more than 30 points. But a year and a half into his presidency, people in this state seem to be pulling back on their support of Biden. That's according to a new poll out of Suffolk University, which found that just 46% of registered voters here approve of the job the president is doing. And close to half are concerned about their personal financial situation or employment. And while skyrocketing inflation certainly plays a role in that, student loans is a factor for many of us. In 2020, President Biden declared his support for canceling debt for millions of federal student loan borrowers in this country.
Immediate $10,000 forgiveness of student loans. It should be done immediately.
But since then, his sense of urgency and intensity seems to have diminished.
I am considering dealing with some debt reduction.
I'm joined by Michael D. Cohen, the CEO of Cohen Research Group and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. Also with us is Alana Semuels, a senior economics correspondent for Time magazine. Thank you both for being with us tonight.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
So, Michael, I want to start with you. In a recent article you wrote for The Hill, you ask an important question here, which is, if Biden can do it on his own, why not do it? And you list the three reasons. I wonder if you could speak to us a little bit about that.
Well, first of all, thanks again for having us on. This is a great discussion, and it's fun to have it actually on NPR. So we actually talk, for a couple of minutes as opposed to like a couple of seconds. There are three big issues when it comes to the politics of this. There's the inflationary issue, there's cost, and there's also sort of a culture / I would say responsibility piece of this. Inflation right now, if you give more people money and you throw more money into the system, it's going to, of course, make a lot of people happy. And of course, it's going to give them more opportunity to go ahead and spend money. But it's also going to increase inflation. On the cost side, if you forgive the debt, you're not actually taking care of the real problem with this, which is actually the tuition costs. You're not actually going to reduce any of that. If anything, you're going to give universities another incentive to go ahead and raise rates, figuring that students are going to be forgiven at some point. And on the culture side of it, the real thorniest issue and sort of underreported / underpolled issue is parents who have saved for dozens of years and kids who have saved to go to college. And, and the idea that they don't want to carry the debt that they know other people are bringing with them. Then all of a sudden they're told that tens of thousands of dollars are going to be forgiven for people who didn't make those choices. And then what do you say to those people? And that really is sort of breaking the long-term contract that you have with people, which is if you work hard and you play by the rules, everything will be fair in the end. If you're forgiving debt of people who did not make the same choices you made, then you're really putting that, in a tough spot. Now, the other piece of this is a policy question. I hope we get to that because there are situations where people are not in a position to go ahead and save that kind of money throughout their careers.
Well, as you said, we'll get to that, but I want to jump in and ask Alana a question because I read your article with these borrowers, especially one woman who had her loans forgiven, and it was life-changing. She was emotional talking about this. So when we're talking about, whether it's going to affect inflation, whether policy is the issue, culture is the issue, how many people actually feel like, everyone should be forgiven. This is really life-changing for so many people to have this debt load forgiven.
And one thing I'd add is about fairness. If you think about fairness, I spoke to a woman for a recent story who borrowed $22,000. She's already paid back $34,000 and she still owes $42,000. So I think there's a lot of ways that these loans are structured that just aren't fair. If we're saying, let's just give people back the money that they borrowed for tuition, waive the interest and fees, ask people to pay back the money they paid for tuition, that would be one thing. But we have people who are racking up tens and thousands of dollars of loans for tuition that was maybe $20,000. And I think we've seen through a number of lawsuits that have been filed against some of the servicers who took on these loans that a lot of the way these loans were administered and the programs were administered were not fair. And you've seen lawsuits that tried to wipe out some of these loans, but they just really haven't worked. And so, I think back to the last financial crisis when you had all these banks peddling risky products. And, what did we do? We bailed out the banks. You have all these servicers who are peddling risky or kind of unfair loan products. And now we're saying that the borrower should be on the hook. And I don't know that that's quite fair.
Yeah, there was a recent poll that came out that showed that 19% of folks, just 19% of folks polled believe that all debt, the total debt that folks owe should be forgiven. That's astounding to me. There it is right there, the Morning Consult and Political poll there. That is incredible to me because you would think that people would want overall to have this burden be lifted off of so many Americans struggling now, especially after the pandemic. Only 13% wanted forgiveness for lower income borrowers. Michael, does that sort of play into some of what you're talking about here in terms of the culture around debt forgiveness?
I think it also goes to fairness. I mean, so for certain people who have gotten these loans that you can even almost say are predatory. I mean, some of these programs, the way that they're put together, are putting people in a situation where they're not even going to get out of this mid-career. I mean, I know people who have gotten their PhDs, and it took them until in their 50s to get out of them. Now, that's not because they were loaned so much money. It's because of all these interest payments and the way these things are structured. So I think your point on this is actually very important to understand. But it also sort of speaks to the idea here that there are levels of forgiveness that people are willing to accept. So for example, Joe Biden's campaign promise was for $10,000. But there's also been some reporting that there are several groups that are trying to push for $50,000 or even more. And so when you look at all of those kind of moving pieces of this, people are trying to get their heads around it. And what that poll shows you, as someone who's been a pollster for 25 years, is that there's no consensus other than not all debt should be forgiven. But there's clearly some people who have been put in certain situations that should get more debt forgiveness than others, and that it should be much more targeted as opposed to not. Now, I would say that there's one piece of that poll that is fairly interesting to me, which is like for lower income people. Well, to be fair, there are people who are saving at the beginning of their careers for kids because they're having kids young, or even just sort of the beginning of their careers. And they may not have made a lot of money at that point, but now they make a lot of money. So would you then put people in that kind of bracket as opposed to the bracket where they were actually saving for college? And so there's so much going on in this. It's very hard for most people to get their heads around it other than, well, not everyone should get it. And if we're going to do it, we need to do it for basically the people who really need it and who are really screwed by the system.
Yeah, Alana, are you finding that in your reporting, you're talking to borrowers, but as you hold other institutions accountable as part of your reporting?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I think that's interesting to me is that, speaking of that poll, if you think about why this would help a lot of borrowers, I've talked to people who don't think they can ever buy a home. They don't think they can ever have kids, or they can only have one kid because their loans, they're never going to repay their loans. They're not going to repay their loans till they're 60 or 70. So there's a macroeconomic issue here, which is, yes, if these people have more money and their loans are forgiven, maybe inflation will go up. But you might see a higher birth rate. You might see more household formation. And so I think it's almost hard for me to understate the number of people that I've talked to that are just completely crippled by student loans, and they just see no way out. And they just feel like they're working to pay off their loans and that's it. And it just doesn't seem like a very good place for the economy to be in, with all these people who are just feeling pretty hopeless and that they can't ever start a family or really do anything else besides pay off their loans.
Yeah, and Alana, to follow up on that, we know that in 2020, 2021, Biden said that he wanted to focus on pre-existing programs to start to chip away at this loan debt for folks. I mean, it doesn't seem like, given what we're hearing from borrowers, that that's going to be enough. Would you say that that's enough?
No, and I think you have a big problem here which is that this is so political, that you had programs that during the Trump administration, people were supposed to be forgiven or supposed to be allowed to apply to have their debt forgiven, and the administration just wasn't processing them. So I think if you're trying to do this through the legal system and do it piecemeal, it's just not going to work. I'm not saying that I have a solution, I don't know if the money amount is the solution, but this has been a problem for such a long time, and it's just growing and growing, and it's so political that we're really not helping anyone out so far, I don't think.
Yeah, Michael, same question. Does leaning on these pre-existing programs work, or will it work as part of the solution here?
No, and in fact, I'm really happy we got to this part of the conversation, because we can now shift to talking about the policy issues here. The biggest problem is really not the debt side. It's really about what it costs to go to college. It shouldn't cost what it costs to go to college, and the inflation on the cost of tuition has well outpaced basic inflation over the past 2 decades. And so to a real extent, if you're going to make any changes in how the debt programs work, you need to also very clearly set some limits and set some targets on these universities who are charging so much money and keep raising their prices. Because if we solve the problem now, let's say we just, for whatever reason, wiped away all the debt, the college debt. Well, what about the next generation that comes up? What do you do for them? Okay. You're saying, okay, if you're lucky enough to be born within this group of time, you're going to be forgiven. You have not solved the problem of higher ed costs. You've basically just said, you're lucky, you got it solved here. So what we need to do is we need to figure out how to contain those kinds of costs. And when you do that, you need to really put much bigger footprint into how these universities are raising their prices every year, and also find ways to build into the system ways for people to get free college tuition if you are at a lower socioeconomic level. If you have other issues, in your life and you want to go to college, you should be able to have programs that can help you get there without a ton of debt. And if you have to take out debt, that these programs don't essentially assign you to, being geriatric by the time you get your debt gone.
Yeah, I would also say that we should also look at the way that these loan servicers operate as well as part of that equation. But in the last couple of minutes that we have, I do want to ask about this, because we know that there's a disparate impact in terms of folks of color who borrow. We know that there was a Brandeis report in 2019 that showed that 20 years after graduating, white borrowers reduced their debt by 94%, while black borrowers actually retained or held that debt by 95%. And so there's this disparate impact. And so does that color the way, pardon the pun, does that mean that we need to approach this loan forgiveness solution differently? And Alana, I ask you, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that really just highlights the need to do something about this. I mean, I think since 2020, we've really had a conversation about racial equity in this country. And this is such a huge way that disparities are created, with people racking up more and more money as they get into these programs and nothing really happening. And so I think, if anything, the awareness of the racial disparities should really make us realize that this is not a time to talk about new policies or setting some sort of guidelines going forward, but to really figure out what we can do now so that these disparities don't keep increasing.
Michael, final word on this.
Yeah, I disagree. I actually think it's now time to think big. It is a big problem, and it is even bigger for people of color. And in most cases, when we had, for example, the housing crisis, it hit the families of color worse. Any kind of debt always seems to hit those groups worse. And we need to figure out, number one, are there certain loan practices that are predatory, particularly for those groups, and maybe start structuring certain education programs around, before you're allowed to take out that kind of debt, what you're really getting yourself into. Because otherwise, you're just signing over that paperwork like it's the terms of engagement with your iPhone that you've decided, okay, I'm just going to hit agree. I'm going to take it. I'm going to go play with this app. We need to get our heads around a lot more what kind of a commitment you're making and what kind of choices you're making. Are you choosing to go to a private school when you can easily go to a public school? Are you choosing a college when actually maybe a different program is better for you? So all of these things need to be put into the mix of making that lifelong decision to take on certain debt. either it's for your house or for college or for anything. And I think that we need to start thinking big about higher ed, because otherwise we're just going to be solving this problem again 10 years from now.
Right. All
Crystal,
right.
can I just add really quickly that private loans, if we're just focusing on federal, if we make it harder for people to get federal loans, a lot of them will go to private student loans, which are majority people of color, and those won't get forgiven by Biden. And those are even more predatory. So I would just say, I think this whole system where the services are piling on interest in loans, whether it be private or public, really needs a rethinking right now.
Okay, we're going to leave the conversation there. Thank you so much, Michael Cohen, the CEO of Cohen Research Group, and Alana Semuels. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.